Hey everyone. So let's start. Let's start from scratch. Let's start by creating a new document. So, who am I? My name is Jani, Eväkallio. My keyboard doesn't know how to spell my own name without using the assistive keyboard. I'm Eväkallio on every platform that you might care about, Twitter or GitHub. And you might not have heard of me during this fellowship a lot. I'm the mentor for the React pods 04x. And I'm essentially a software engineer by profession. I've been doing this for quite a long time, something like 15, 20 years. And the reason why you haven't heard of me a lot during this fellowship is that about 3 weeks in, I built a little project called Foam. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. Not necessarily the product itself. The product is pretty self-explanatory. You can read about it on its website. But what I mainly want to focus on, well, first a little initial thoughts on what the project is, but then use this project as kind of like a narrative tool for discussing some things that I feel like I've learned on my career, being an open source developer, being a being a professional developer even, but just generally being a person who identifies themselves as a product developer, as somebody who loves shipping products instead of just writing code. So here are some of the learnings that we're going to be touching on today. Firstly, just to get us all on the same page, a little bit about what Foam is, then talking about where good ideas generally tend to come from, how to rapidly test ideas so we know that we're building something meaningful. Once we built them, how to launch things, how to get them out there. And then if we are so lucky that they are successful, how to actually scale some of our side projects. And finally wrap up with just on a discussion on why you should generally make or create things. And I'm pretty sure I might have actually broken that link. Okay, cool. So this is the agenda. I hope that the first half only takes no more than 20, 25 minutes. So we'll have the other half an hour for Q&A. But if I start to ramble, then some of my pod fellows can yell, unmute and yell, like, stop rambling, you're doing it again. Dad, that's so embarrassing, or whatever, whatever you want to say, you can say that. But yeah, okay, let's get started. So essentially, a Foam is what you see right now. It's a note-taking environment built onto VS Code, and it's inspired by a tool called Roam Research. Now, Roam Research is a pretty interesting tool. It implements something called network note-taking and a methodology described in a book called How to Take Smart Notes. This is a book that describes essentially like a fairly simple methodology for being able to take notes in a way that actually makes sense for your brain, but also makes sense for you in terms of long-term accessibility of that information and like spontaneous meeting of ideas inside of your own note-taking system. So normally when we write notes, we write them in some kind of like journaling format or linear format. We might have different books for different themes, one for school, one for, I don't know, anime shows that we like or whatever. But the idea here is that by creating sort of one holistic system in which we take small atomic notes that we can essentially like find information related to each other. And what kind of like makes this network thought sort of interesting is the ability for those thoughts to kind of form a graph. This here is a very simple graph. This is just the notes that we're going to be running through today. But in reality, of course, this would be much bigger. And so what this is essentially like an implementation of Roam Research or some of Roam Research's key features, but implemented inside VS Code. And on top of GitHub. And the reason why I did this is because I wanted to use a powerful text editor instead of underpowered web-based editor that will never really kind of feel as useful for me as a developer. I also wanted to own my own data. I wanted it to be free and hackable. One of the motivations for creating the software was that Roam Research is quite expensive. It's $15 a month. And I feel especially for many of my fellows at MLH, but many others, it's quite a steep price. I wanted to have this kind of, democratize access to this technology that I think is very useful. And then finally, I wanted to be able to publish my thoughts to GitHub pages so that like this, if we look at this, sort of repo. This is just a pretty standard repo of Markdown files. And as we know, we can push a repo of Markdown files and publish it as a GitHub page. In fact, if we briefly, I don't know how to use windowing. That's interesting. If we really briefly look at what Foam is, it is an open source project that contains both code and documentation. The documentation is itself a Foam workspace that is rendered into a website. And then, this website essentially, acts as a kind of public representation of all the knowledge that exists related to Foam, the software product. So you can use this for software documentation, but for your personal notes, web publishing, blogging, whatever it is that you want to use it for, you can. We haven't yet really optimized it for all use cases, but we will build more sort of templates for that in the future. And what is kind of interesting about Roam and Foam broadly is that they are part of this new genre of applications called tools for thought. Tools for thought is essentially, a kind of like a reactionary movement against, sort of hyper capitalization of software, where, like we aren't actually building tools and technology to augment sort of human abilities, because it's very, very hard to monetize and productize, basic technologies like writing text. And Roam research is clearly, taking another approach at this, which is that they are trying to monetize it and trying to make it not freely accessible to people. So what I am trying to do with this project is make some of the basic powerful technology available for everyone. And the article that you might want to read if you're interested in tools for thought in general is this article by Andy Matushak and Michael Nielsen called "How Can We Develop Transformative Tools for Thought?" Anyway, without further ado, and without going too much into details of Foam, we can let's kind of go back to the beginning and start talking about the things that I hope will be more beneficial for you down the line. So where does one get an idea for a project? Where do good ideas come from? This title, Where Good Ideas Come From, is actually a title for another book that I recently read, a book by Steven Johnson. And it has a couple of different editions. One of them is this one where they call it The Natural History of Innovation. But the one that I read is called, oh, interesting. The one where I read is called 7 Patterns on Innovation. And these 7 patterns are kind of very helpful for understanding, where ideas come from. But I think 3 of them are very, very relevant for us as software engineers and as some people who want to create open source projects. First one being the adjacent possible. So let's move into that. The basic idea of ideas, being born out of the adjacent possible is that good ideas rarely occur out of the blue. When we just try to think of, ideas out of the blue, it is very, very hard. But also, even if we do, they aren't very successful in the market. They're considered being ahead of their time because they don't actually connect to any existing need or any existing understood product. So good ideas are often just one step away from what is previously possible. It's like the idea of discovering new ideas is like walking through a house, is that you need to open a door and enter the next room before you can reach the room that's behind it. You can't just jump, teleport through them. And Foam is definitely a great example of an adjacent possible. All I really needed to do was connect the dots, take the existing tools that we as developers have, VS Code and GitHub, and take the ideas from something like Roam Research or the book How to Take Smart Notes, and put those together and open a door to the next room. This is something that I feel most people could really benefit from, just thinking about what is it that they do today, and what problems and opportunities and what doors can be opened from those things. But in order to explore the house of ideas more, we need to cultivate something that, as Johnson in his book called, the slow hunch. And this makes the case that good ideas are rarely just this one light bulb moment in which you will suddenly just get it. It's a slowly evolving hunch, or like a series of ideas that start building on top of each other. And we need to cultivate this hunch. We need to actually sort of like sit with it and work with it and look at it from different angles. Taking good notes, for example, and like allowing our ideas to cross-pollinate with other ideas. So I'm personally, like I'm cultivating my hunch regarding tools for thought. I don't know yet what my ultimate contribution to this field will be. I know it's not necessarily foam. Foam is just one milestone towards that. But the point here is that an idea isn't ready when you first talk about it. You are essentially just always constantly evolving your idea. And the longer you sit in a particular domain and really deeply explore it, the more likely it is that you will come up with some kind of meaningful innovation. And what really helps us, the software developers, is that we are building on the shoulders of giants. We have platforms and ecosystems that are ability to foster and supercharge, innovation and ideas. Here's a quote from Johnson's book. It's, it's a paraphrasing of how Tim Berners-Lee created the web, is that he didn't have to single-handedly design a new medium because he could build on top of open protocols of the internet platform. He didn't have to engineer a system of communication between computers because that already existed. All he had to do was, build a standard framework for describing hypertext pages and sharing them via existing internet channels. And I feel like this is where us as software developers, especially open source software developers, have an upper edge in the kind of like competitive marketplace of ideas, is that, we do have freely available platforms that we can freely, build on top of, but also mix and remix over time. Now, and foam, by the way, is a perfect example of this. I barely had to do anything in order to build this tool. All the tooling existed. All the millions of lines of code that go into VS Code and GitHub have already been built by Microsoft and open sourced. So I did not have to do much for it. But then once you get an idea, the question is, what do we actually do with them? I feel like this is where I have most secret sauce or kind of lessons to teach, because what I find is that most people actually fail to test their ideas before they commit to them. Committing to an idea is a very, very scary thing, because every yes is a no to everything else that you might be doing with your time during that time. And life is just way too short to be working on projects that don't actually have very high likelihood of success. So here are my methodologies for how to rapidly testing ideas. I have been able to successfully apply these number of times in different open source projects that have all been very successful. And I hope that these can be useful to all of you. First one is, my secret sauce, which is what I call README driven development. I fundamentally believe that writing is design. Instead of starting software from a point of view of what code do we need to write, what architecture do we need, what programming language do we use, we actually need to consider the use cases for it. And for open source software and open source libraries, the README file is actually fundamentally the most crystallized communication of the value and purpose of that project. So I often start all of my projects by writing the README before writing the software. And this is how I did foam as well. It forces you to consider the usability and approachability of the solution. And you could also think of it as an API first design. If it's not a product, but if it's a tool, maybe you design the API first, how it's supposed to be used by a user before you actually even consider how it should be implemented. But most importantly, this allows you to explore big ideas in a small amount of time, because you can ship a small amount of software, but in your README, you can include them as kind of future development items or roadmap items, and see which ones people are excited about and which ones they they latch onto, and that way you don't have to build any of them without knowing which ones are going to be successful. And fundamentally, it's also a marketing asset. People don't read your code, but they will read the README, and that's how they make the decision to, explore it more or to share it to others. And just to give you an idea of the scope of this, the foam's initial release was about 80 lines of code that I wrote, but it was about 2,500 words of README, and that essentially got us trending on all meaningful developer platforms, which I'll talk a bit more about on how to launch things. But once we have an idea what we want to build, I think the second part is prototyping. So instead of going ahead and building large quantities of software, I think we need to build the minimum, not even a viable thing, because a minimum viable product that we all hear from lean software engineering is actually a bit of a nebulous term, and viability kind of means that it needs to be something that is usable in the market. But there are much more cheap idea validation tools than MVPs, and prototypes are my favorite. I think every piece of software that we ever built should always start its life as a prototype, because it allows people to use them, a tool for themselves, to give you in-depth feedback before you actually commit to implementing it fully. And that way you find out what works, what doesn't. Or in the case of non-functional prototypes, it allows people to see your vision and give you feedback on it. And this doesn't even need to be code. It could be a keynote presentation. It could be an InVision prototype. It could be even pen and paper. All you really need to do is you want to create something that communicates how your software is supposed to be used. And Foam was actually intended to be a non-functional prototype. If you look at what Foam actually is at this point, it is a settings JSON that describes a bunch of settings that makes VS Code act a lot more like a note-taking application. And it's an extensions.json that installs a bunch of extensions that other people have built. For example, this graph that you see here, Markdown links, is not something that I built for Foam. It's been built before. Similarly, this mechanism for seeing backlinks, which I haven't really demonstrated yet, where you can see what document links to what, is from another extension. So I started prototyping this with the idea in mind that, like, I wanted to see for myself, how would it feel like to use something like this in VS Code before I commit to building this piece of software myself. And turns out I didn't need to build this software myself at all, because all of those building blocks and the extensibility and platform effects of VS Code and Markdown allowed me to make it a shippable product without actually writing much code at all. And there is a Foam Zone extension. It was about 80 lines of code when I built it first, and when I shipped it. Now it's a bit more, but all it really did was act as a glue for all of these other extensions to work together. Now, obviously, not in every domain do you have enough building blocks to have a functional prototype that you can ship to production. In fact, I wouldn't recommend shipping a functional prototype to production. But what this definitely shows is the ability for being creative about using existing sort of tools and materials in order to validate ideas, which we clearly have validated here with this. Going into rapidly testing ideas, back into this, I'm sorry, I'm actually running a bit late in schedule, so I'll move this fast. The next thing we really need to do is we need to make sure that we focus. We need to, for initial sort of validation of idea, we need to do as few things as possible, and we need to know what we're focusing on. If you do try to bring in the kitchen sink for your prototype, it will never ship. And the most valuable thing of a prototype is that you get the validation quickly and fast instead of broadly and for a whole host of ideas. And another book I would recommend is Deep Work by Cal Newport. It essentially describes a bunch of different techniques that allow you to have a lot of impact for your time in a very little time. So I personally practice something called Deep Work sprints, which allow me to essentially just like pick a goal, work on it for a couple of hours and achieve it instead of endlessly working on a ill-defined set of goals. And fundamentally, you need to be okay with releasing crap. I think the biggest mistake most people make is releasing way too late because they are shy or they feel that people will judge them for the crap code that they wrote. But you have to be okay with people seeing unfinished work, because work is never finished. A product, when it ships, is always just the starting point for something. And you're not going to make a great product in a month, so why not release an okay product in a week? But then there's the other thing is that it took me way too long to make this presentation because I kept hitting bugs in Foam, so I had to fix them instead of working on the presentation. So there definitely is a downside to it as well. All right, but let's go back. I am making my way through this list of things. So now that we have essentially we don't necessarily know how exactly we're going to build the software, but we know that we need to do it quickly. How do we actually launch this? This is something where I see most sort of very, very well-deserving software projects actually never make it out of the gate, is because their creators don't know how to market and launch them. So number one, launch on multiple channels. At a very, very minimum, a launch of an open source product should be, of course, a public project in GitHub, should be a tweet on Tech Twitter. I should be a post on Hacker News Show HN section. It should be posted to Product Hunt. It should be posted on all Reddit, channels that allow for posting own content. And it should have a blog post. You should also be using your personal network to amplify the messages. So ask people who you know to share it, because it doesn't really matter how it gets to where you want it to get, but one retweet from the right person can kick off really a storm of visibility that then runs, gets your project going. And if you don't get it out there, then, it will never get the visibility that it deserves. And then, all of this itself is kind of useless if all you get is like a click or an eyeball. What you really need to do is drive people towards an action that you want them to do. That could be starring the project on GitHub, subscribing to your mailing list. It could be downloading an app. And for example, if we look at Foam itself, here on the very, very top, I just have essentially 2 calls to action. You can either follow me on Twitter or you can join the Discord. And that way I will now have access to communicate to those people across, sort of like whichever platform that I choose, which means that I have now a seed for sort of further marketing communication. And well, okay, briefly, we could talk about timing, but I think for this purposes of timing, I'll leave that out for now and move forward. So essentially what I'm trying to say is, like you need a good idea. You need to build it quickly. You need to get it out there. There's also a point at which having a successful side project actually kind of sucks. But there are some ways of making that process better. The first one is just to understand that product development is always a marathon and it's not a sprint. It means that you should do a little bit every day. Use deep work sessions from the same book that I mentioned, but like try to avoid yourself by burning out. And the best way to do that is to welcome contributions from other people. This is something that in open source, we kind of like think that happens for granted, that we can just say, oh, this is open for anybody to contribute. Please come in and do so. But in practice, that doesn't work. You need to make it super easy for people to contribute. Leave, good first issues to contributors. Use the all contributors spec and bot in order to make sure that people feel like they are being recognized, and just generally like activate people to contribute when they're interested. This is fundamentally the only known way, as far as I know, to scale a side project, because the problem is that once you start a side project, either you abandon it, in which case it provides you or nobody else anything value, or you will be maintaining everything that you create for the rest of your life. And neither of these strategies is successful in the long term. So if you have even a little bit of interest, it doesn't need to be thousands of people like in my project's case, but even if it's like a few dozen of people, try to build a small community around it, because that community keeps people coming back and keeps people communicating to the, contributing to the project, which in the long term will help you extricate yourself from the project in a kind of day-to-day maintainer role so that you can pursue other activities and interests, because it's very unlikely that the open source project that you create now will be your life's work and the end goal, the final project. And the way you do that is just being a decent and good human, being kind and courteous in issues, being generous with your praise and attention. If people do a good thing, tell them that they did one, and start a Discord server or a place where you can kind of like have a more personable communication with them than just what happens in GitHub issues, because GitHub issues are very transactional in the end. All right, so if having successful side projects is so hard, like, if we need to do all of this work, if we essentially are already, by the time that we have started the project, we are looking for ways to get out of the project, why should you ever make anything? And this is kind of like the core of my thesis, is that making or creating things is actually the best strategy for software engineers to improve their careers. Number one, we live in, we exist in sort of an attention economy, if you will. our industry overall is really bad at valuing, real value creation, like how good you are at your work, how good a collaborator you are. These are the things that should matter. But what actually ends up mattering is some other signal that is often very much related to how much attention you're able to garner. And ultimately, the world is roughly split to makers, talkers, and consumers. Consumers are the people who never make anything. Talkers are the things that just popularize what other people do. But makers are the people, in my opinion, who end up in the long term, getting the most respect, but also the best opportunities. And as a maker, the idea here is that it doesn't matter whether you make today is necessarily the best thing. But just overall building an audience over time is what I call seed capital for your future endeavors. Every time you make something, people will associate your name with the things that you make. And then when you make the next thing, they are excited to see it. That's why right now, if you look at people tweeting about foam, people are by and large tweeting it like foam by Jani, which is kind of embarrassing in the kind of sounds like some kind of fragrance, but at the same time, it is the best way to actually sort of connect the labor that you do in order to make a project like this happen, and to make sure that you get the benefits from it. And it's because making eventually, at the end, it accrues what I call compound interest on your time. Because every time you make something, it will continue to exist, and it will, pay dividends for you as long as you live, or as long as you care to benefit from it. So whether it's a blog post, whether it's a software project, whether it's an art project, but every time if you have an opportunity to choose, if you have the mental energy to choose, what are you going to do with your evening? Are you going to consume something, or are you going to make something? And if you're the kind of person who has ideas for making things, I think the answer should always be that you should make things, because making strongly correlates with success, and the more you make, the more you get to benefit. And here, I kind of ran out of time with the slides, but I also believe there's two questions that my fellows in my pods keep asking me all the time. One of them is what is the best way to learn? What is the best way to learn a new technology, pick up a new skill? And also, how do I find problems to solve that I could turn into open source projects? And the answer to both of these things is to create things and make things, because creating things forces you to actually learn in an in-depth way. If you're learning just for the sake of learning, you can always find an easy way out when going gets tough. Like when you're reading a book or you're doing a tutorial, if there is something that isn't covered by the tutorial, you will never have to push yourself into finding out how it works, and therefore you're robbing yourself of an opportunity to learning it. But it's also the best way of discovering new problems to solve, because what a problem is it's actually a very, very inconvenient situation. You should never want to have problems. Problem is when, you need to get something done and you cannot because there's a blocker and no solution for it exists. Therefore, you have now discovered a problem that needs a solution. But the best, in our maker economy, in the reputation economy, in the attention economy, the best thing to be is a person who is constantly barraged with new sets of problems, because those problems turn into opportunities that then turn into personal value and gain. And the best way to discover new problems is to try to make things and see what is it that is very, very difficult today. So I think that's pretty much, my, presentation portion of this. I intentionally kept it at quite high level. I want to focus more on the Q&A. So anything that just came out of that, any questions, either practical strategies or questions regarding to project open source, everything is welcome. Yeah, I think that's enough from me. Let's go to the Q&A.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jani, for going through all of that. I'm sure everyone's got lots of questions. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them in the Zoom chat, or you can send them in, you can unmute your microphones by raising your hand. But we're going to start off with a few ones that were submitted beforehand, just to kind of warm up. You've already answered kind of what is foam, and is foam a unique idea, and you've already kind of answered what gave you the motivation to create something like Foam. Now, something that I kind of asked was, what made you decide, well, you kind of brushed upon it, but what was like the main thing that made you go open source with Foam rather than making it like a paid for thing?
Well, I mean, for one, I believe in open source. I believe in the power of open source to actually create sort of, I don't know, value and opportunity for people. But in this particular case, it's because I felt like the thing that exists in Rome research should be broadly available for everyone. And I feel like $15 a day, $15 a month is not broadly available for everyone. And that's why it was important for this to be open source. But even further than that, it's impossible for me to actually, I don't have the time to build something like this end to end from scratch. I think I need other people to help me, and open source is a great way to find those collaborators, which we already have. We essentially have a core team of Foam in place today, so it's very useful.
Perfect. So you've been working on Foam now for a little while, and I was wondering what some of the future plans or some of the like things you'd like Foam to kind of end up with in the next like few months, maybe even the next year.
Well, in a few months, I want it to be the best note-taking app, not for just for, you know, in open source, but like best note-taking app that a developer could potentially use. You know, I want it to be so good that people will choose it over any commercial option. And then in the next year or so, that's still a little bit out there. Either we'll package up Foam in like some kind of an app that we can productize and sell. Because it would be nice to also like form a business around this in a completely separate entity from the open source project. Because that's one of the things that I think is negative about the open source ecosystem, is that it is kind of allergic to money and like sort of, you know, capitalism. Like if anybody tries to benefit from open source work that they do, they're somehow labeled a sellout. And I don't think that that is a very current way of thinking. And I think we're already seeing a lot of successful open source companies. And I think Foam could potentially be one of those down the line.
Perfect. So we've had a few questions in the Zoom chat so far. The first one is, can you show us an example of what you might share to communities, for example, like Reddit or dev.to, etc.?
Sure. So for Foam, the thing that can you see my screen still, by the way? Yes.
Yes, we can. Yes.
So what I shared to in regards to Foam was just a link to the Foam's own documentation site. This is what I posted to Reddit. I didn't post anything about Foam to dev.to because, well, I don't follow my own rules. But I do have a better example of a past project that I have I built. So previous to Foam, my most popular open source project was something called Redux Offline. And what I wrote here is a blog post. And this one was on Medium because Medium was the dev.to of its time. But essentially, this is a blog post that, you know, in a very sort of like human-friendly, readable way, you know, using very beautiful graphics that I, you know, drew, just describe what is it. And again, this is very much README-driven development. But then at the end of it, you know, there's very much like a call to action. It's, you know, what to do, you know, how to use it and where to go in order to, you know, make use of it. So, you know, essentially when you create content, you shouldn't have to create separate content for every platform. I think you need to create like one master version of what you want to say and then slice and dice that for different platforms. So for dev.to, it's a blog post. Then you take the top hits of that and you make it into a Twitter thread. Then you take your README where you collect same ideas and you post that project into Show Hacker News and into Reddit. And essentially just create like this torrent of content that you didn't have to work very hard to create because the same content just repeated in different ways, and make sure that no matter where people get their tech news or their, you know, find their new things, that they will land on that and they will always end up in the same place where you want them to end up, which often is either your GitHub repo or your project's homepage. Or in some cases, like mine, I really just wanted them to follow me on Twitter because, you know, I'm like that.
Perfect. I do know how that feels. So something that I feel is quite relevant is the moment you're working full time as a mentor for the MLH fellowship, which does take up quite a lot of your time. Now, how do you balance that with working on foam as well as working on that, and also, you know, just keeping sane at the same time? How do you balance all those things? We can't hear you anymore for some reason.
Oh, I broke it. I don't know when I last said something. The reason why it's hard is because this right here is the MLH fellowship Discord, and this right here is the foam Discord. So what I do during the workday is that I take this and I drop it in this little folder over here. And then I don't have to, I don't know why it doesn't go there right now. I don't have to see it. So essentially I try to create like complete boundary between foam and MLH during the day. And then in the evening, I practice these things, which I already a couple of times mentioned, which I highly recommend, is doing focused sprints with like a time box and like a measurable goal. I call them like deep work sprints. But it's instead of like allowing the project to consume all of your time from 5 p.m. to when you finish your MLH work to midnight, I just say today I'm going to do 2 hours, and in this 2 hours I will achieve this one thing, and then I do it, and then I can feel good about it.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's really useful advice. Now, following on from this kind of like work-life balance thing, someone asks, do you prefer working in a team or solo? And how would you, how about when working on side projects? How does that all work?
So in work, I definitely prefer working as a team. I think nothing meaningful can really happen in the kind of like, corporate setting with just doing solo work. I think the complexity of the projects that we have that we build, like, it's becoming, even if technology is making us more productive in terms of being able to create bigger things by ourselves, but just the complexity required to actually produce value when all the low hanging fruit has been picked means that nothing kind of massive can be achieved alone. So definitely as a team. But then ironically, I would like to, if at all possible, in my open source, to work alone. And the reason for that is that when you work alone, you just get to do whatever you feel like. You don't have to be working towards goals or setting plans or roadmaps or managing people. You can just, revel in the fun of writing code. But somehow I always end up with these projects that get quite a lot of attention and contributors, and therefore I end up working as a part of team. Anyway, I think that's why I keep starting new projects. It's just to find a new thing that is just for me and nobody else. Nobody else cares about it.
Cool. Please keep getting those questions in the chat while we go through the next few questions. If you don't want to put it publicly, feel free to message me personally on Slack or on Discord or on the Zoom, and I'll happily read that out anonymously too. So going on from that, what's the most extreme reaction you've gotten from rejecting a pull request on a project you maintain?
Ooh, I think the most extreme reaction, I think, is when I rejected a PR, the person went and forked started maintaining the fork in which they submitted the PR from, and made the project more successful than my own project. So I think that was very much of a classical tale of I would have been better off just collaborating with the person than trying to fight their ideas. But fundamentally, it doesn't really matter. Nobody's ever been mean to me on the internet, like on GitHub, and I've tried not to be mean to other people on GitHub, and I think that kind of helps keep a mutual sort of balance. I wouldn't be too afraid of that. But also, you shouldn't be pressurized to accept the PR just because it might hurt somebody else's feelings to reject it. Projects need a visionary. Like if everything is done as a accumulation of all the crap that anybody can think of, then it will soon become like a kitchen sink. So it's okay to be ruthless about it. I reject PRs all the time, and I don't feel too badly about it.
Yeah, as one of the maintainers mentioned in one of the Q&As, they said adding features just means that now you've got more things you need to support, and if the feature is something that could be a plugin or like doesn't need to be part of the core product, then it should be that, because adding features for the sake of adding features just makes your life in the long run harder. So a really interesting point there. Now we've had a few more questions in the Zoom chat. We've got one from, oh wow, loads of questions. Let me just open this. Oh no, the chat's disappeared now. It's not going well for me. All right, so Rohan asks, will you ever decouple this from Visual Studio Code?
Well, so there are already like decoupled versions of this. You can, for example, use Obsidian, which is a similar standalone tool for Mac, which you can use. One of my goals here is to use Visual Studio Code, because it is so powerful. But I have forked VS Code already. I have a private fork of it. And in fact, this is running on my private fork of VS Code right now, because I am looking to maybe package this up in a way that people can just download a foam app instead of downloading full VS Code. But all of the code and the features that we're building will maintain compatibility with VS Code, so that you can always run it as an extension or as a standalone app. I think that's a choice. I mean, I could do it either way around, but for me, I see a lot more value in this ecosystem rather than trying to build something standalone, which already exists and is very competitive market.
Makes a lot of sense. No, that's really cool with Visual Studio Code being open source, you have that option to kind of bundle it up as its own little thing. I suppose you don't really need to have like the debugger as part of it and stuff like that. Perfect. So we've got another question saying, can Jani further explain in detail what he meant by the kitchen sink analogy when he talked about focus?
Sure. So I think sometimes I use idiomatic English phrases without knowing whether, because I'm a second language speaker as well, so I don't know if things are common or not, because everything is learned for me. But there is this saying, everything but the kitchen sink. And it just means like everything imaginable. And it just, I used the phrase kitchen sink, even though it's everything but it. But what happens, I think, a lot in software design when you don't have a, sort of like a focus on like what is the single most value creating thing that you can do, is that there are so many cool ideas that you could do. That you end up never finishing or like finding the scope of the project. I personally could probably sit down for a month and just write down ideas of what I could do with foam, but that doesn't do anybody any good because I would never implement any of them. So I think it's much more beneficial to find out what exactly is the single value creating thing. And for me in foam, it's very, very clear. It's network nodes, the ability to navigate between nodes, view them as a graph, and then see relationships between those nodes. That was the minimum thing that needed to be built. It could be built in a few days, and now I am free to build other things on top of it. Now that it already has a contributor community and somebody to validate ideas with.
Perfect. So we've got a couple more questions. Someone asks, many ideas would require some funding/capital even to develop. How to manage those expenses without a source of funding, or should I find one of those sources for funding first? So I know it's actually quite relevant for you because you started this kind of on your own, but you've actually had a few venture capitals and stuff approach you about this and about funding. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, obviously, if you do have an idea that requires capital to develop, then you cannot develop it with a capital. That is the meaning of the word require. But I would call bullshit on like 90% of cases where people think that they need money to do something. If you're a software developer who has a working laptop and an internet connection and $300 worth of credits from AWS or Azure, you can do quite a lot with that in order to prototype ideas. And I'm very much talking about, prototyping in the sense of, building something that allows you to validate ideas either by demoing it, testing it, or at least seeing what it would feel and look like to test. And once you have that in place, and once you have actually like what's called a market signal, that people actually are interested in this, then you can use that as a tool to go and try to seek funding. But if you are trying to raise money with just an idea, I think you're going to have a hard time unless you are very well connected or you have other credentials to your name. And taking money too early is kind of dangerous. I've worked at startups who did that, and that's why I'm not doing with foam. I think taking money before you know what your product is or knowing where you want to take it is essentially just putting yourself on a treadmill where you need to keep running, because now you have $500,000 and that gives you a year of runway, and in a year you need to be able to raise another 2 million, or otherwise you need to fire all your employees. Like, it becomes like this rat race where you've essentially just like gotten yourself a very hard problem to solve and a timeline at which to solve it. And a much better place is to have a very hard problem to solve, but no rush to do so. So I would try to figure out free or cheap ways of validating ideas before taking money. Yeah, I think that's my answer. I'm sticking to it.
Cool. Awesome. So we've had another question, another one as well. So the first one was, would your process have been different if Foam was a paid/closed source product? Or if you were making a different paid product, for example, with launching and advertising it, are sites like dev.to okay with seeing closed source/paid products?
Is the question whether sites like dev.to are okay for marketing a closed source paid product? Or
I think, about my advertising it on sites like that if it's a closed source product.
So I don't actually use dev.to very actively, so I don't know what the vibe over there is, but generally trying to advertise a paid product, you need to work very hard in communicating what the value is to a user. So with free product, it's very easy because you're kind of doing it out of the goodness of your heart. So you can put it there and people go like, oh, nicely done, you made a free thing, here's some free advertising space. But if you try to like extract money or other resources out of it, I don't know that I would personally, as a viewer, be very happy to just be browsing on like dev.to and go like, well, why is somebody selling to me? So that's why in dev marketing, it's very common for people to utilize these roles like developer advocates or other sort of, there's another term for them. Anyway, developer advocates, because essentially what these people are, they are like content marketers, that sell to developers who don't like to be marketed to. So I would be very careful with paid products to focus solely on the value that you can give to a person and not the value that they have to give to you in order to use it, meaning money. I also don't think that launching a purely paid product is a very good idea if you want to grow in the market. I think you definitely do want some kind of free tier if your product plan at all allows for that, which then makes it a little bit easier to sell on a platform like that. But yeah, be careful about the optics. Don't take the piss. And also consider if you actually do have a paid product that you're trying to ship, then like maybe you have also other means of marketing it. You can actually do a proper PR product launch with tech press and all of that. So there's a lot more that you can do with it.
Cool. So we've got time to take a few more questions. Our next question is, what are some of the red flags to look for when working on a side project? How do you know if it's better to abandon the project than building it?
Well, I think that's very simple. If it doesn't have any users, and you've tried to push it a couple of times, then just abandon it and do something else. Like the idea that the reason why, for example, the venture capitalists are interested in Foam is because it showed traction. Like it showed that whether or not it's a good implementation of the product, but generally that there's a market for it, that people, like the idea and they're willing to, try it out, smash the GitHub button, the GitHub star button, join a Discord. And I think that just shows that there's like some traction behind it. If your project is not getting any traction, then abandon it and spend your time doing something else. I think that's clear cut. But if you are getting some traction on it, why would you abandon it? It's when you run out of passion, like when you no longer want to be doing it yourself, when you find a better idea that you're excited to work on yourself. I think those are times to abandon it. And hopefully by that time, somebody else in the community has already picked up some of your maintenance burden for you, so it doesn't need to die a death.
Perfect. So our next question, will probably only take this one, maybe one more, depending if anyone else sends any. How do you transition from being a developer to maintainer as the project grows? I'm sure many people are great developers, but are not necessarily be the best maintainers, or even want to fulfill the maintainer role. So how would you go about that?
That's a great question. I think I'm one of those people who wants to be a developer, but always ends up being a maintainer. So yeah, I don't think that you are required in context of open source. I don't think you're required to take on any mantle that somebody else is trying to push onto you. You can also choose to outsource that work. Like if you do have other people who are interested in developing it, just give them the commit bit. Like this is what we do with Foam. Every time somebody lands a meaningful change, whether it's in documentation or in code, I immediately give them the right access to the repo. Master branch is still protected and it needs to go via PRs that needs at least one approval. So it's not like anybody can just like, you know, take the piss and force push over master, but it just makes them a lot more able to take on the maintainer role, to review PRs, to merge PRs. So giving responsibility away if you don't want it is a perfectly valid strategy. If you do want the responsibility and control, then by all means keep it to yourself. But I know many open source project maintainers who are more of creators and writers. They only write new features and they let other people do the maintenance work. And that's totally valid.
Cool. So we've got one more question and then we're going to have to wrap things up. So Chris, one of our mentors, asks, what interests or excites you the most about the thought tool space? When Foam is well developed, how does this enable people? And then he also says, what does this enable for people to, or how does it benefit?
So I highly recommend anybody who's interested in this to read the article, How Can We Develop Transformative Tools for Thought by Andy Matuszak and Michael Nielsen. This is a great and very long article where they first describe a particular sort of, you know, implementation of a memory system that is a, you know, a canonical brand of tools of thought, and then explore tools for thought more broadly. And I think my answer to Chris's question is somewhere here. Isn't this what the tech industry already does? Isn't there a lot of ongoing progress in tools for thoughts? You know, and so you could say that in some ways, you know, a lot of the things that we are building, like, you know, drawing tools, search, Twitter, Slack, Google Docs, programmer tools, that they are already tools for thought, which they are. But the kind of like the framing for the tools for thought movement is more or less like trying to create tools that specifically are democratically available to people and augment, you know, their ability to think well. Which is, by the way, very different from the Rome Research. If you go to romeresearch.com, they have this like really, you know, scary thing here where they say, where is it? Here, they say, if we can build a tool for helping people write and organize their ideas more effectively, we can help them have better thoughts and solve otherwise intractable problems. I think other than the concept of, you know, qualifying whether people have good thoughts or bad thoughts or whether they should be better or worse, I think there is definitely, this is the core mission of a lot of the tools for thought space, is how can we actually give people tools that augment the kind of like the mushy soup of brain that we have in our heads that is not like, it is very effective at processing information. It's somewhat effective for, you know, retaining information, but how do we augment it with tools and technology that enables us to just do more with it? And so that's what I think Foam can really do. Right now, Foam is mainly concerned in the long-term information storage, as in like finding a way of writing notes and keeping them discoverable over the long term. But I think there's a lot of things that Foam wants to do in the space where it is a lot more about also freeing up processing power for you by becoming essentially like a information lookup kind of a query place, but also just like a more fluid note-taking environment in which you can keep your to-do lists, in which you can keep your sort of you know, short-term thoughts so that you can enjoy lower cognitive load and focus on, for example, your coding tasks instead of forgetting to you know, document that issue that's on the top of your mind. So I think there's a lot that if we bring the ability for people to really view of like information and thoughts as fluid continuum all the way from like a to-do or a note to a piece of documentation or a long-term article, like long article, and you can bring all of that into the environment, the IDE in which they already work, I think it can enable people to have happier professional lives. Having low cognitive load is highly correlated with you know, happiness and lowered stress. and high stress is highly correlated with burnout and like misery. So if we can reduce people's likelihood to burn out and improve their ability to work effectively over long periods of time, then I think that's kind of like the biggest goal for us.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jani, for answering all those questions and giving us kind of a bit of a different insight into foam. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to ask them in the sessions channel on Discord. Jani, I'm sure, will be more than happy to answer them. You can find more information about foam on GitHub. I'll drop a link in the Discord. But that is all from me. Thank you, Jani, for taking the time to chat with us today, and we will talk to you all soon.
Thank you very much.